Welcome to another episode of the Watchdog with me, Lowkey, here on MintPress, where we go toe to toe with the elite narrative and investigate the powerful. We hope that you will like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And also, we hope that you'll be able to support us on Patreon as an independent form of public interest journalism. We need all the help and assistance that we can get. So please do that. This week, we are joined by a colleague of mine at MintPress and safe to say a viral sensation, Greg Stoker. Greg, how are you?
Doing well. Finally got over the jet lag here in London. Thanks for having me on.
No problem. How are you finding London?
Well, I went to the protest this past Saturday. I forget which day it was. Everything's alighting into one. Like the news cycle is so insane that it's just one big mashup of atrocity after atrocity. But yeah, it was nice. It's very nice to be out of the United States right now. Let's just put it that way.
And how would you compare the sort of protest scene in this country to the US from what you've seen?
Well, okay, so there's definitely international solidarity. There's a lot of similarities in terms of organization. The big difference is, we have different governments and different police structures. So I definitely found, and of course I haven't been to many protests within the UK, but the actual state forces, the police, like sometimes we have National Guard in the States, way less adversarial here, for sure. Generally, like when there's a pro-Palestine protest in the United States, it's pretty easy to clock like a couple of sniper positions from TAC teams in the States. And of course, that's contrasted greatly with, we recently had a big nationwide hands off our government protest against like the Trump administration. It was entirely problematic. It was very like peak liberalism. One of their demands was hands off NATO, and there wasn't a single uniformed police officer for those protests, and they were very large, happening in every major city. And so
the implication of what you're saying is there was an element of sponsorship from one part of the state.
Yes.
Which part of the state?
Element of sponsorship. I would say it's not just. I'd say it's the entirety of the state itself, in terms of like government capture, the mobilization of police forces under the guise of protecting a certain group of people from radical extremists.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was the cops. The U.S. government is using, and so is the British government, is using the guise of the pro-Palestine movement to crack down on free speech organizations and under the name of domestic and national security.
But yet there's elements of the U.S. deeper state which seem to be mobilizing against the president.
I suppose so. I don't really track that much. Mobilizing against the president in which way?
Well, from what you said, it seemed that there was a protest against Trump,
right,
which was policed noticeably differently from the pro-Palestinian protests.
Absolutely. Well, I've been to these type of protests before during the first Trump administration, organized by like Democratic Party organizers and stuff like that. No police presence. Yeah. So basically, it's just the pro-Palestine stuff and anti-ICE immigrations and customs enforcement that really gets challenged by the cops.
Yeah, and I think your eye, when looking at these things, will generally be more discerning because of your background. Would you say that's true? If you were to compare it to, say, the layman.
Yeah, I mean, basically, the Special Weapons and Tactics team are like generally filled with military veterans, and they go off the same kind of combat doctrine that actual ground forces in the U.S. military go off of, because the police was, from its foundation, when Sir Robert Peel founded the UK Metropolitan Police in 1829, it was inherently militarized from the start, and they always taken tactics from the military. So it's pretty easy to anticipate where cops will be, how they'll set up their cordon, where they'll put in shooting positions, and stuff like that.
Interestingly, when it comes to the London protests, what you used to have up until a few years ago is positioned, if you'd be speaking in Trafalgar Square,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure if you're familiar with Trafalgar
Went through
Square.
there.
Yeah. Opposite, there is, I think, a gallery of some kind. And on the roof is the perfect vantage point.
Mm-hmm.
And what you would have is somebody up there with a camera focused on you speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember that from being a teenager, and I'd speak at the protests. But over the years, that has gone. And so I do wonder what the thinking behind that is.
Well, why do you need a camera there when there's CCTV cameras every square inch of London?
And there's also the spy cops that infiltrated over 1,000 political groups over a few decades in this country, who would be just in the audience with a phone anyway.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't need that. But it's quite interesting that that existed, because also that would be hypothetically a point where a sniper could be placed also,
Mm-hmm.
that could reach directly the stage if it was ever deemed necessary. So, Greg, tell us a little bit about your background then, because you're demonstrating knowledge in the way these things work, and that has to have come from somewhere. What's that background then?
Yeah, so right out of high school, the day I graduated, I was on a bus to Fort Benning, Georgia for basic infantry training. I went through airborne school and I went into a special operations unit after I passed selection. It's called a Ranger Regiment, basically focusing on like land warfare and airborne operations. That's kind of like our niche within the special operations community. And I did 4 combat deployments to Afghanistan, and that's what around like 2009 to 14 during the Obama's Afghan surge, and that's kind of what radicalized me into being like an anti-war activist. And it's kind of sad that we have to say like that's a radical position right now. Um,
And so initially, what was it? One of the things that I've noticed about the United States is that the military is ubiquitous. It's advertised all the time,
mm-hmm.
on TV.
Football
It's
games, the Super Bowl,
inescapable.
really it is.
It's really inescapable. And you combine that with a situation where you have something like, what was it, 200 guns per head?
I've
So
never heard that
more
term.
guns than human beings
Oh
in,
yeah, in
in on,
America,
on
yeah.
on U.S. soil.
I think it's specifically not just guns; it's more assault rifles than people.
Right.
So that's fun.
Now, you have the combination of that. In your case, from your perspective, what were the pull factors aside from the constant advertising? What was it within you that made you feel that that was something that would be a worthwhile endeavor?
Well, I was never like a Captain America, super patriotic person. It was just it's not a unique story. People join uh, the military because they feel like they have nowhere else to go. I came out of high school feeling very disempowered. Didn't want to go to college. Didn't really have any marketable skills. Was coming out of a very dysfunctional family. Didn't want to stick around. So military. Also, I felt like I had something to prove to myself. So I signed up for a special operations contract, and I passed all the schools required to get into that unit. And that was about it. I mean, we could go into the whole like backstory about that, but it's just why a lot of people join the military: economic conditions, uh, early childhood dysfunction, and yeah, I mean, of course, those like super patriotic people existed, uh, but it wasn't my experience that that's the majority of the military.
What was your experience in terms of on the tours? I've been reading recently about some of the ways that they essentially are able to get the job done physically
Mm-hmm.
through, sometimes they might use something called L-tyrosine. And so soldiers will be taking something called L-tyrosine, which allows them to push through tiredness, fatigue, and keep working and feel less fearful of their surroundings. Do you have any experience with any of that? Do you remember any of that?
No, we never took any sort of drugs.
Really?
No,
Right.
I mean, I've heard rumors about like fighter pilots doing it,
Right.
but that's about it.
Mm.
You know, I've worked with just about every special operations unit within like NATO, to include British SAS and Australian SAS and
Right.
SB, Special Boat Service guys. And yeah, I've never heard of that. We weren't even allowed to like drink off duty overseas. So like no
Interesting.
beers, nothing. So yeah, I've personally never heard of that.
Right.
The only time I've heard of that was like Vietnam, the
Right.
Nazis in World War II.
And from the perspective within the military, my understanding as an outsider
Mm-hmm.
is that Vietnam was quite a pivotal moment, because what it led to was the invention of the internet, actually. Because
Yes.
the perception was, had we been better able to map out this society, we would have had more predictive um, technology working on where there would and wouldn't be insurgency, where there would and wouldn't be resistance, because we'd essentially be able to see this community
Yeah.
far more successfully than we were able to. And so, in a way, I think the interesting way that the internet is like so multifaceted, because
Mm-hmm.
on one hand, it allows a far greater um, access to information. So, in terms of investigative
Mm-hmm.
journalism, it has completely changed the game. Prior to the internet, you would have no way of knowing what the tax filings were of a particular organization without going to a government office, having to register in your interest in some way.
Put in a FOIA request or Freedom of Information Act request, which didn't even exist yet, so you might not even get it.
Exactly. So the internet, I think, in that way, has empowered people to investigate the powerful, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But then on the other hand, there's an element of visibility that every single person as a unit of information holds from being on the internet. There's the element of psychological warfare and algorithmic targeting and engineering of those algorithms, which is very new.
Well, that's actually why it was created.
And that's where we get to
Yeah.
this bit. So within the US military,
Mm-hmm.
of course, I'm aware that the point that you came into it, from what I'm gathering, is kind of 2005 to 2008 kind of period.
I turned 18 in like 2008, joined in
Yeah,
2009,
there we go.
and then was in until 2014.
Right,
So I did a 5-year contract.
right. And so, what did Vietnam represent within the U.S. military? Was it seen as a defeat?
Okay, so first of all, time to go on a tangent. So first of all, what you're talking about is like ARPANET. That was
Yeah.
the first initiative to combine different data systems.
And amazingly, and I think this is often forgotten by people, that at the institutions, including MIT, where they were building it,
Yeah,
there were sit-ins and protests against the building of the internet
yeah.
on the basis that it would be invasive of people's privacy. I mean, that's completely discounted from the history often.
Yeah, and in fact, if you want to find those like activist pamphlets that people at MIT were writing about the invention of ARPANET in the late 60s, early 70s, they said exactly what is happening now, what
Wow.
happened. And the only way you can find them now is to like hire a guild researcher to go into either the MIT archives or the National Library of Congress
Right.
to get them out. They don't really exist on the internet because they were suppressed after the Vietnam War. So ARPANET was basically this big predictive coalition system that was one of the greatest examples of the imperial boomerang to ever exist. So basically, colonial forms of repression and surveillance and enforcement almost immediately rebound back on people within the imperial core.
Yeah,
so
the boomerang.
ARPANET was actually used at the same time, deployed at the same time, to predict bombing runs on the Ho Chi Minh Trail against the Viet Cong, while also monitoring anti-war activists, labor organizers, civil rights leaders, Black Panthers, environmental activists, everybody involved in the entire movement. So at the same time that they were monitoring the Viet Cong and bombing them, they were engaged in like COINTELPRO operations against activists in the Vietnam War. So from the inception, the internet itself was a tool of the state surveillance. And then actually the invention of the dark web or the deep web, whatever you want to call it, was actually a program launched by the Naval Intelligence Services in order to communicate with like anti-communist resistance forces during the Cold War. Without being surveilled by the KGB or anything like that. So yes, every advent every evolution of the internet has been directly connected to the war machine and the surveillance state. And I just wanted to put that out there. What was the actual question, though?
So then the actual question was, how does Vietnam figure in the sort of imagination of the establishment within the US military? Is it seen as a defeat?
There's a lot of cope about it.
Right.
First of all, it's like, you know what, we could have won if, the same thing about with the global war on terror, Iraq and Afghanistan. If, the politicians didn't like have one of our hands tied behind our backs, like, no, but there was a lot of restructuring of the military from the Vietnam War, because we found very rapidly that forcing 18-year-olds to fight in an imperial war that has nothing to do with them and create a conscript force where they have like minimal training and then sending them into the jungle isn't really a recipe for success. And the entire chain of information flow from the ground of what was actually happening to Washington was completely distorted as it went up the chain of command. If you want to go down the rabbit hole of like the Pentagon Papers, that's a whole thing about how the information sharing and intelligence sharing and fact-finding missions were completely based off bogus information, sometimes intentionally, sometimes based off of absolute incompetence. And it led to the all-volunteer force. So we no longer have a draft in the United States. It's an all-volunteer force now. And there are now problems because nobody, after 20 years of misadventure in West and Central Asia, nobody really wants to join anymore. So we're kind of seeing this like cascade failure of the U.S. military system that started in Vietnam, was exacerbated not by the Gulf War, because we kind of broke what was called the Vietnam syndrome, whereas like everybody knew that Vietnam was a failure. And so and what I mean by we is the U.S. government was leery of getting engaged in another conventional war until enough time had passed, and then it was like, oh, Desert Storm, we could take out Saddam, and we did. We established like the winning record, which I guess never really existed. First of all, and the global war on terror just destroyed that again, and now people are very disillusioned by what's going on. So we're kind of like a dying military power in some ways, but there's still a lot of inertia behind it. And the legacy of the Vietnam War is not just like military. It's not just like with regards to the military, because of the massive backlash and how effective like workers' unions were in shutting down arms factories, longshoremen were shutting down ports. There were actual mutinies aboard merchant marine vessels taking weapons to Vietnam. The U.S. government, both Democrats and Republicans, went on a concerted effort to bust and break the power of unions forever, started to offshore jobs to South Asia, and
and
kind
then
of
you get
criminalize it.
NAFTA, and then that pushes it. So what's your understanding of veterans that may be suffering the consequences of use of stuff like Agent Orange or depleted uranium? Do you know people that are dealing with their health consequences of toxic weaponry today?
So depleted uranium was used in Iraq in Sabo rounds. I was too young to go to Iraq. I was only in Afghanistan. I don't really have an experience with that. Agent Orange was a Vietnam program that was quickly dissolved because it didn't work. And It caused a whole lot of issues on the battlefield. It's kind of like a chemical weapon. When why you don't really use chemical weapons is you can't really control where the wind goes, so it's just like tactically non-viable at all. And it didn't work the way they wanted to. But anyways, no, Afghanistan. If you get a disability, it's now from burn pits, like burning trash, burning stuff like that.
I've seen that.
I haven't been around that, so I don't have a disability rating for it. But I definitely do know people who now have respiratory issues and stuff like that.
Right, from that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, also it plays out in statistics that time in the military makes more likely a person to suffer homelessness later on in their life.
Yeah.
It makes them statistically more likely to partake in domestic abuse also. You know, a person raised in a military family. Same with police. People raised addiction, of course. What have you seen in people that you were working with? Have you seen some of that stuff reflected later on post-military life?
Oh, absolutely. I experienced that too.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I have a number of friends commit suicide.
Right.
And it's not necessarily because of, I mean, there's this idea of like, you know, they commit suicide because they can't handle what they've done. Personally, I saw them not do any of that. Zero war crimes.
Right.
My best friend Lance didn't really even shoot at anybody ever.
Right.
But yeah, it's just, you know, you join the military because
and Lance passed away through suicide.
yeah,
So, okay.
a while ago.
Right.
And it wasn't because of like the military and getting out of the military, being in such like an indoctrinated institution, and then you're just like, okay, go be free, you know, go live in the world now. It's really difficult to reintegrate back into society, especially from like a combat unit that's experienced that, and it's kind of like isolating. But like all of this, it all starts in childhood. There's a reason why you join the military. It's an all volunteer force, and a lot of people have like unresolved issues.
Exacerbating factor.
Yeah, it's definitely an exacerbating factor. Like childhood abuse is like huge factor in like veteran statistics and stuff, and you know, also military indoctrination in the military itself is also abusive. So it kind of like reinforces this kind of like abuse mentality.
So what do you mean
like,
by the indoctrination is abusive? What do you mean?
Okay, so you join the military, you go through like basic training or boot camp, whatever the Marines call it, and you're basically degraded and broken down in order to quote unquote build you back up.
Yeah.
But it's not really like a punishment and reward system. It's basically just like a punishment system.
Yeah.
So
in a sense,
and it's also like inherently violent.
Yeah.
And so when you get out of that, you don't really know how to navigate society. A lot of guys can't really hold down jobs, have relationships, and of course, drinking is a huge thing throughout the military. And people don't know how to stop. And yeah, it's really not the war stuff, because it's not just, it's mostly not even combat veterans who are committing suicide. It's a lot of like soft skill MOSs too. So our MOS is like your job in the military.
Right. So what you're kind of alluding to here is it's the way that you are sort of re-socialized once you enter the military,
Yeah.
which then makes you less, I wouldn't say able, but less positioned to, once you're in society, which is not requiring you to use force and violence as your
yeah. And again, it's an exacerbating factor because
Yeah.
most people join the military again as an all volunteer force because they weren't properly socialized in childhood to begin with.
I see. And in terms of more racial stuff,
Yeah.
what was your experience of the sort of indoctrination in terms of that we have to morally justify, you know, visiting upon these societies vastly more advanced technology than those societies have. I mean, you know, the military, even when you look at the role of the military in almost every single industry in the United States to speak of, it's right at the peak of it. So it gets the very best of the thinkers of science, the very best of, you know, so, and then it's coming to these societies which don't have that. And in the case of some of them don't even have functioning armies. And
most
most
countries
don't.
in the global south don't.
Yes.
And that's, by design. But anyways.
Exactly. And so in order to sort of justify that, there has to be a basis whereby, and correct me if I'm wrong, the people are deemed to be of inferior humanity.
Yeah, I mean, Edward, the Palestinian American professor, Edward Said, kind of wrote the fundamental canonical text on this phenomenon in his book called Orientalism. It's the old colonial playbook. It hasn't changed in 500 years. Look at these backwards people. You're less than human. We're here to civilize you.
So it's said explicitly to you. When you're in the military, look at these backwards people. We're here to civilize them.
It's not institutional. Like, there's no handbook on it. It's just like, yeah, look at these fucking dirt merchants.
Dirt merchants.
Oh yeah. Well, there's a way worse than that.
Way worse.
Yeah. I'm not gonna say it here. But yeah, of course, it's the same thing the British did. Same thing the French did.
Yeah.
We think that these things exist in or some people do. Especially like pre-October 7th, that this was a bygone part of our history.
Yeah.
It existed during the reign of Queen Victoria.
Yeah.
Or like King Louis or whatever, or Napoleon. But it's literally, we're watching a genocide unfold in real time. And literally nothing has changed.
Right.
Like, if you just go on X or Twitter and read what all of these right-wing pundits or Zionists are saying, it's literally the same kind of disgusting language that was being used in the British Raj to justify, destroying the Indian textile industry.
However, I have a question on that, though, that pertains to the U.S. military side of things.
Yeah.
The U.S. military, directly or indirectly, killed 1 million people in Iraq, over 1 million people. Directly, indirectly. There's ways in which people died that can be linked to the invasion and the occupation. However, though, there was not genocidal bloodlust in the way that there is in Gaza.
Yeah, this is one of the reasons why I started. I've been an activist for a while. I just wasn't public before like October 10th. That's when I switched my socials from private to public.
Right.
So first of all, when it comes to the casualty rate in Iraq, the death count, it doesn't matter if it's indirect or direct. Overthrowing Saddam with no plan caused a massive power vacuum that led to sectarian violence and the rise of the Islamic State. And that never would have happened if we never went there. So yes, we didn't kill 1 million people with bombs and bullets, but we definitely did produce the circumstances, the conditions in which that happened.
Millions were
and
displaced.
It's probably more than 1 million.
Yeah.
But anyways,
but my point is, is that there's a genocidal bloodlust to Zionism in Palestine, which is not necessarily. Functionally, it can be the case with U.S. imperialism, that there's genocidal consequences of U.S. imperialism. But is it genocidal in the same way?
I have a personal anecdote that kind of demonstrates the kind of training ethic that we had in 75th Ranger Regiment. So after I passed selection, I got like my fancy tan beret, which was like our unit marking. Then I went to my unit, which was 2nd Ranger Battalion out of Seattle, Washington. The first time I did a live fire shoot house at night, which is basically like there's a compound with a mezzanine on top where all the observing officers that like watch what you do as you go in on night vision and you engage targets. I was new. I was like trying to impress people, and I was new. Like, night vision doesn't have a lot of depth perception, and it's like a skill you have to develop. I shot a civilian target in the shoot house, one of my first shoot houses. And then,
so just confirm what that means. You shot a civilian target.
So there's like silhouettes. There's kind of like mannequins with like, some have guns, some don't, some are dressed like.
And so by mistake, you shot a civilian target.
Right, in one of my first shoot houses when I was a new guy.
And this is training.
This is training. Yeah. And then one of the OICs, the officers, the observing officers, was like, "Index, turn the fucking lights on." And I was like, "Oh shit." So the lights come on in the shoot house, take off night vision. It's just like, "Who the fuck is that?" And I was just like, Stoker. Fuck. Yeah. And so I was warned, like, hey, you get like a couple strikes. If you do that again, you're out and you're getting sent to the regular army.
Right.
And never made that mistake again.
Right.
Um,
So what?
and I just know that the IDF isn't doing that.
Interesting. So this anecdotal story
Yeah.
you're saying is reflective of an institutional
I mean, at least
will to avoid civilian casualties.
at least within my unit,
Yeah.
we know that the SEALs don't have that. For instance,
which was the Rangers, the 75th
Ranger Regiment. Yeah.
Ranger Regiment.
Yeah, the SEALs a little bit different. I'm not going to go into the inter-unit beef, but the bottom line is there was no commands, there was no like institutional doctrine where it's like we're going to fight what the Israelis call devastated terrain warfare.
Yeah.
Which is basically where they just saturation
Scorched
bomb
earth.
everything.
Yeah.
And then just leave it there.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a completely different doctrine. And what pissed me off so much, and of course, Obama's drone strikes was a heinous crime.
Mhm.
It was absolutely insane.
Mm.
That's why one of the reasons why I didn't re-enlist for a second contract or go into the CIA, which is what I wanted to do since I was a kid, because it was so reprehensible. But there's a difference between that and an institutional thrust, not just from the military command echelon, but from the political leadership within the government to be like, we're going to wipe out this entire people.
Mhm.
And they actually say it too.
Yeah.
You know, their entire military doctrine, one of the things they have that's baked in that they use constantly is called the Dyad doctrine.
Yeah.
For the audience, that's basically, it comes from the 2006 Israel-Lebanon war, where they bombed a suburb of Beirut associated with a Hezbollah stronghold relentlessly, purposely hitting civilian targets in order to pressure the associated combatants into coming to the table, you know, surrendering unconditionally, getting political concessions before a ceasefire takes place.
Mhm.
And so that's, and by definition, it is collective punishment of the civilian population, which is a war crime. There is nothing I've seen within U.S. military doctrine that even comes close to that. That being said, we are the evil empire and we operate that way. However, I guess there's a semantic difference between that and what Israel was doing, because I watched on October 10th when they were dropping 1,000-pound bombs on Gaza, one of the most densely populated places on earth. And those bombs are not meant for that. They're meant to destroy hard sites and bunkers and also to collapse tunnels or like cave systems. And what they were dropping wasn't even big enough to collapse what the resistance forces use in Gaza. But anyways, those strike packages would never have been authorized. Not in Baghdad, not in Kandahar or Afghanistan. So I was like calling my buddies. We were watching the Al Jazeera live feed on October 10th or 11th and be like, "Are you seeing this?" And it's like, "Yeah, it's absolutely insane." And what really sparked me to start just talking about basic tactics and how all this works or should work or did work, at least within the context of U.S. forces, who are not the good guys, but that was just so egregious, was watching these paid-for military pundits on Fox and CNN, you know, veterans of the global war on terror, say like, yeah, we did this. We did this in Mosul. We did this in Baghdad. No, we didn't.
Would you not say they did it in Raqqa?
Raqqa?
Yeah. With the
the counter-Islamic state action.
Yeah, with the bombing during the Obama period against Daesh, because that's often used because
Mosul was also used as well for that.
But you're looking at upwards of 12,000 civilian deaths, if not more, during that bombing. Would you say that was not mobilized at that time? At least akin to what the Israelis are doing.
Yeah, I definitely see it that way. But one of the real things, and again, I'm not trying to be an apologist at all.
Yeah,
I was just trying to like
work through. You're right. Mosul, they also did Raqqa, but Mosul, I think, was worse.
Was worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, they also
Fallujah as well. would you not say?
Fallujah, most of the ordnance dropped was not the bombs. It was mostly 30 millimeter grenades,
Right.
artillery shells from Spectre gunships, and attack helicopters,
Right.
and like Hellfire missiles from drones. I know it's semantic. It's just
No,
like
I
an
understand.
ordnance. It's a
very
complete
meaningful. Yeah, yeah.
ordnance difference.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Where you could destroy one level of a building and keep the building intact.
Right.
However, there was an
leveling.
egregious
Yeah.
casualty count. The only reason I'm getting bogged down on this is because like it's kind of what stirred me, because it was so beyond my military experience.
Right.
Out of the 200 odd like direct action combat operations that we performed, we dropped a whopping 2 JDAMs, and that was on IED facilities that had no one in it.
This is where
Afghanistan.
This is in Afghanistan. In your experience of that,
yeah. So just seeing this, I was just like,
JDAM used a lot more in Gaza.
Yeah, my entire 5 years, we only dropped 2 on targets that had no one in them. So because even if we tried to, they'd be like, yeah, you're not authorized, you're not cleared for that. So seeing that, the massive bombing campaign, while they were trying to figure out how they're going to do a ground invasion into Gaza in early November, I was just like, this is absolute insanity. It's unprecedented. Like even Mosul, which I thought was horrific and stupid, didn't even come close, not even fractionally close. And I was, when I had a top secret security clearance, I was plugged into the targeting cycle for drone strikes. I know how, and they use the same technology that we use, and it hasn't really changed that much. There's the advent of AI, but still the basic targeting parameters and principles are the same.
Right.
If you want to target a high value individual, you go through something called multi-source reporting, which is like voice confirmation, cell phone signals, image intelligence, like you put surveillance drone on them, and then maybe you have a ground, like a human intelligence source on the ground being like, okay, yeah, he's in the building. It's called multi-source reporting. You put all these different things together, and they're not even doing that.
I mean,
they're just dropping whatever they want to.
I mean, in the case of Hassan Nasrallah, when they dropped the bunker buster bombs,
that was probably from a human intelligence source with inside Hezbollah.
They claim that it was the human intelligence unit. It was also the visual intelligence 9900, and also unit 8200. Yeah, which is the
signal.
Yeah, so I guess technically in that assassination, but what you're saying is that you wouldn't mobilize a bunker buster bomb for the Nasrallah killing then necessarily.
I mean, that's the only way they could get to him. They dropped like 60 in order to like level the entire compound.
But this killed hundreds of people at the same time, at least.
No, they don't care. But the salient point here is, I guess you could argue that Nasrallah was a legitimate military target. Whatever. They've dropped over 80,000 pounds. 80,000 of these bombs.
Yeah.
You think they were doing that painstaking intelligence collection for all of these targets? No, we know that they've come out with 2 different AI targeting systems. There's Lavender and there is the Gospel.
Yeah.
They're based off of different parameters. One's a where's daddy? When you come home, it kind of drops the entire building. All I'm saying is it's beyond my experience. And that's why I started speaking out about it.
So but what you're pointing to is quite an interesting fissure, really, in what is a very, very vital relationship here. So you're saying that the way in which Israel is carrying out this war made you feel so passionate that you went into a public-facing mode. Okay. But you're pointing it out from an operational standpoint. Do you think that that's common within the because the involvement of the US military in what's happening is, I mean, The Intercept put out a story saying there were likely to be US Air Force personnel helping with targeting at one point. it would be interesting to know, firstly, what you think the involvement of the US military is, not just in, often it's focused on, okay, they're supplying the weapons, but even the supplying of weapons comes with all types of operational interlinking in terms of a daily way. And so it would be good to know what that actually entails from your perspective. But then if you think there's more people on the US military side of this looking at this, horrified with what's happening. Of course, you had the Aaron Bushnell case, somebody self-immolating who was U.S. military. So tell me what you think. Number one, what is the true extent of the U.S. military's role? How on the ground is the U.S. military with this? And then number two, what do you think the extent of unhappiness may be in terms of rank and file U.S. military?
Okay. So first of all, I guess we could come at this through a number of different angles. First of all, I'll just say that, yeah, I felt passionately about what was happening in terms of the strike packages operationally, but I guess it might be helpful to back up and talk about like how I kind of started to understand, the Palestinian cause. Um, because I grew up in Texas, surrounded by like Christian evangelical Zionism, and of course, I've always been secular. But you hear some problematic things, especially during the global war on terror. The conflation of like Hamas and PIJ and the PFLP of all things with like Al Qaeda, which is absolutely insane. But what started to kind of like break or like get me to kind of break out of like the mainstream narrative, not that I was ever really invested in it at all, was through the military literature. So there's something there were position papers published by the Pentagon and the U.S. Army War College out of Fort Leavenworth. It's called the Combined Centers for Strategic Studies. Uh, anyways, it was their official position that in the 2006 Israel Hezbollah war, Israel suffered a very embarrassing strategic defeat, and I was kind of like, wait, this is the position of like the Pentagon officially. I read all the literature. I was like, wow, this is really damning. The officers and rank and file troops, the non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, just were not prepared for war. They couldn't achieve combined arms, which is where like tanks, the Air Force, the artillery, the infantry all work in concert together, which they still can't do. That's why they just bomb everything. Uh, and that's why they never get out of their vehicles. They just stay buttoned up in their tanks and their APCs because they just can't do that. They don't want to do that. So they just saturation bomb. And I was kind of like, huh. So like, why are they like the most moral military? And then I read about the bombing campaign of Daya from that. I was kind of like, and that was kind of the unraveling because it's not like when I was in the depth of like imperial military indoctrination, I like gave a shit about human rights. I'd be lying if I said I did. Because I was very, it's just war. There was one sin though in that mentality that was unforgivable, and that was military incompetence. And so through that kind of ideation, that's what started to unravel the propaganda for me, of all things. Just them being an incompetent conscript army that doesn't listen to anybody. They're actually assholes to work with.
This is the Israelis.
This is the IDF.
And what was the extent of your working with the Israelis?
Never, thankfully. A couple of my buddies did like liaison programs with the IDF, and they're just like, apparently these guys are insufferable. They think they know everything when in fact they suck. And that's all I really needed to know. So it was actually through the military that I started to understand like the Palestinian perspective on everything.
What I mean, this has turned me to very interesting place. What was the perception of Jonathan Pollard within the U.S. military? Jonathan Pollard was the U.S. Naval officer, naval intelligence, who was spying for the Israelis. He was able to get a lot of nuclear information and give it to Israel and help develop Israel's nuclear plan. He was later jailed and recently has been allowed out and went to the Zionist entity and now lives there. And interestingly, what you also have is quite a few important military databases now have involvement in them from companies. For example, Lockheed Martin
Mm-hmm.
will have its cybersecurity carried out by um, former Unit 8200 people.
Yeah, I'm sure there's not a
So
back door into that database.
exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas actually this was the thing with Pollard, this was the thing with Robert Maxwell, this was the thing with the Promise software scandal, is that the Israelis were searching for back doors basically into the US databases, and now they have it.
Mm-hmm.
This is from what I understand. And um, what's the perception of that within the US military?
So, first of all, not a lot of Americans in general, even within the U.S. military, know about Jonathan Pollard, or even like huge
Within the military,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
Really?
or even huge profile events like the USS Liberty. I didn't.
Wow.
I was in the military for like almost 3 years before I even knew about that.
Right.
Most Americans don't know about these things, and it's
Right.
intentionally like that.
Right.
There's been a huge propaganda campaign, and sometimes propaganda fills a negative space where it's meant to delete information
Yes.
and erase it. That's also a form of information operations and propaganda that the Israelis are historically way better at than actually pushing their own narrative, just making things disappear. So I didn't really know about that, Jonathan Pollard. But one interesting thing is a couple of my friends went through something called the Foreign Area Officer course,
Right.
which is basically this course you go through if you're going to be a liaison officer with a different military in a different country.
Right.
They teach about operational security, what the threats are, how to interact with the local population. And one of the first seminars is you get a adversarial critical threat ranking briefing. Like who does the most adversarial collection on US military personnel, intelligence personnel, and diplomatic staff.
Yeah.
It's not Russia, it's not China.
It's not Iran.
Israel. It's not Iran, because Iran doesn't have any global power projection.
Yeah.
It's Israel.
Yeah.
They're number one.
Yeah.
And that's not like just one dude's opinion. That's
No.
actual US
Fact.
military
Yeah.
doctrine that everybody learns. So
And so you're saying that even though the soldiers would learn that, they wouldn't necessarily feel passionate about it. They wouldn't. I mean, what's the
it was an
perception?
officer course, and like most officers didn't go through it.
Right.
And like you'd only go through the Foreign Area Officer course as a non-commissioned officer, as a sergeant, unless you were like really senior, like first sergeant, something like
So
that.
you didn't go through it, or you did go through it?
No, I didn't go through it. I was only in
Right.
for 5 years. I wasn't.
But you're
senior.
aware.
Oh yeah. And I just recently interviewed John Kiriakou, who's an ex-CIA guy.
Yeah.
They have the same exact intelligence briefing that the military does about
Right.
Israeli adversarial collection.
Yeah.
And nobody who's ever worked with the Israelis likes them.
Really?
Yeah, I've never met someone who worked with the IDF or someone from the clandestine services
Right.
who was stationed in Israel be like, yeah, really got along with these guys. No, they're insufferable.
So you did say, Greg, you said that you'd always wanted to be in the CIA from when you were young.
Yeah.
Why?
Oh, adventure, I guess. I kind of romanticized it. Also, like when I got into special operations, I had a certain skill set. I was like good at like learning languages, and also, so I got, and I had a knack for like human intelligence stuff, like interrogations and field interrogations. Which is where you interrogate someone in the field, determine if they're the actual person you're looking for. Because a lot of times they won't have like birth certificates or photos.
What do you mean you had a knack for it?
I was just good at identifying target individuals.
Right.
And I also kind of had an unorthodox technique because I like didn't really believe in negative incentives.
Interesting.
So there's a whole spectrum when it comes to like interrogation theory, where positive incentives, like the most positive is like money, cash for secrets. That's the oldest intelligence game in the book.
Right.
And that's actually the safest way to do it.
The
most reliable way to do it. And then there's like flattery. It's called different things like ego up, ego down. And there's like neutral stuff, like which is what like cops use, like what we would call like the omnipotence technique, or like the we know all. It's like we already know everything. it's also called the futility approach. So like, why are you even lying to us? You're just making this worse for us. And then going all the way into negative incentives, you have torture.
Yeah.
But also negative incentives can be like threats and stuff like that.
Right.
Um,
And so you say the money is actually the biggest in terms of
it always has been.
statistically speaking, it's the one that gets people
Yeah,
doing what
because
they
a lot
want
of
to
these
do.
people, despite what the narrative is, they're not really ideologically driven. In Afghanistan, there was like a lot of mercenary foreign fighters too.
But
So
also, it doesn't last long though.
yeah, it doesn't.
The money is a positive incentive. In the case of Afghanistan, for example, I mean, Karzai is nowhere to be found.
Yeah, I mean,
So,
Afghanistan was a complete mess. But anyways, so I started getting more into that, and that's kind of how I got exposed to the whole like Israeli thing. And I don't know,
right.
that entire world of like human intelligence collections really uh, disenfranchised me with the whole system too, because you meet fucking psychos, who are just like, we
Who are
really
working
need
with?
to put the screws to this guy so he can start
Right.
talking. And I was just like, dude, I don't. First of all, it's not effective. Also, um,
It can probably
yeah,
also lead to false intelligence, I guess, is the
absolutely,
problem,
yeah,
because a
absolutely.
person being tortured will
Yeah, but like
eventually
a lot of
probably
these
turn.
people did it because they got off on it. Like it like
Yeah,
attracted like some of the
of
worst
course it
people,
did.
just like
Yeah,
being a cop does.
yeah.
So, um, getting back to the question, which was crap.
The CIA.
Oh yeah, I don't know. So basically, my plan was to do 1 5-year contract in special operations, like get some
Right,
field experience, then go to a Ivy League university because that's like
right,
literally the recruiting pipeline.
right,
So I went to Columbia University, of all places, where I got radicalized into crazy jihadism,
right,
whatever the Zionists say about Columbia now.
right,
Uh, and then that's where I started double majoring in international relations
right.
and anthropology. And through anthropology, I got into post-colonial studies. That's where, like, canonically, the syllabus was like, okay, we're reading Orientalism now. And I was like,
Yeah,
wow, this
right.
this makes so much sense about why we're
Interesting.
doing all that bullshit overseas.
Mm,
And through my engagement with post-colonial studies, I was like, you know what? I'm not doing the CIA thing.
right,
Yeah, and I actually ended up dropping out eventually and doing
right.
my own thing. But yeah, that's kind of like my
Wow.
journey from completely problematic imperialist without knowing what imperialism was
Right.
to where I am now.
Absolutely fascinating. I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing this with me. Just before because we are unfortunately going to have to wrap up,
Yeah.
Greg. We were getting to what you think the U.S. military involvement is in the
Yeah.
genocide in Gaza. Could you shed some light on that?
First of all, in terms of U.S. military involvement, I haven't put a lot of time into really digging. I've talked to people who are still like contacts in the military who are still in. From my understanding, and of course, my understanding is not complete. I don't think anybody's is, unless you're directly involved in it. Is that we are doing what we always do with Israel: intelligence sharing. We have military assets and surveillance aircraft in our Air Force that they don't have, uh, that Britain also has. This is why they're running surveillance flights out of Cyprus. We're doing that too, feeding and integrating our systems to give them targeting data for whatever and however they use it. They use it.
So,
So
you,
we're
so
giving them the surveillance platforms that are more advanced than what they have.
which it aids the target acquisition,
Absolutely.
and that's both Britain, the R1 Shadow plane, and U.S. Reaper drones. No,
AWACS.
right.
Have you ever seen the aircraft that kind of look like a jetliner, but they have this huge like satellite dish node on top of
Right.
them?
That's the AWACS.
Yeah.
Okay.
So they have massive intelligence and surveillance and signal intelligence capabilities. So like they could
They
process like
can.
every cell phone signal in Gaza
Wow.
simultaneously.
Wow.
So yeah, we're
And
doing
those are
that.
going on top of Gaza.
Yeah, they're doing they're like in a constant holding pattern since this thing started.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's insane. So like whether they're guys on the ground or not, it really doesn't matter. We are so inextricably militarily involved in that, even if it's
Right.
only in an advisory capacity. Because at the end of the day, okay, there's boots on the ground, but again, what we know from like the 1973 or their war in the early 70s, was they ran one of the big things that we realized is Israel ran out of munitions.
Yeah, they had
within
Operation
4 weeks, where we had to mobilize the entire U.S.
to
industrial
drop it
base.
on the field.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like they can't do this without us. They can't. Their military is designed to fight short, violent wars that don't
Right.
exist for more than
So
6
the
weeks.
sustainability is all from the US.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
my last thing I'll say about this is like, the buck stops with the United States. You know, I call this I consider this a tripartite genocide.
Yeah.
Because the U.S. is the empire, Israel is our colony, but Britain is the old empire that gives us like coalition legitimacy. They'll always like hang on to our coattails and rally other European states behind the United States. So they like that's why Britain was like, yeah, Iraq War, let's go, Tony Blair,
and operate as the back channel. Because so, for instance, the US wants to engage Iran, Britain is kept there to engage Iran. You know,
absolutely, and so couldn't do it without us.
Yeah. So, in your experience, would you say it's fair to say there's a sort of trilateral security state which is permanent, which is the British, the US, and the Israelis? Obviously, Five Eyes is.
It's absolutely failing right now, and I'll just end with this. It's failing because, well, it's complicated, but we're the dying empire. Britain's also having its own issues with its own collapse. Domestically, the material conditions here suck as bad as they do in America. I think you guys call it the cost of living crisis. But anyways, Israel is a country that doesn't have a lot of strategic depth. It's tiny. Generally, in conventional terms, it means there's not a lot of distance between the front lines of a conflict and your industrial centers. But it also applies to politics and economics. You know, it doesn't have a lot of strategic depth. So, like, when they call in 100,000 reservists, it sends their entire economy into a tailspin. So, our aid packages aren't just for bombs. They're stimulus packages, which Israel has discretionary spending power to put in different sectors of their economy. So what they're terrified of is because they have no strategic depth, both militarily, politically, economically, is their focus on sanctions. They're terrified. That's why they're so terrified, even if they're like, we're going to stop 2 types of missiles from being sent. Because it sets this precedent that could set the entire house of cards into a cascade failure. Because if one sanction happens from a Western country, it's going to create a trend, and then that's game over. So they're fine with us sanctioning illegal settlements in the West Bank. They're fine with us sanctioning Daniela Weiss, Frau Genocide. But like, once we start sanctioning them, and it's not going to start with the United States. It's going to start with European countries. Because look at South Africa. Who are the last people to keep holding out Israel and the United States? But it's going to be the beginning of the end. And it's going to happen eventually. Not anytime soon, but I don't think so. But it's inevitable at this point.
Do you think it's safe to say that even if Israel were to succeed in completely wiping Gaza off the map, which is what it wants to do, in a way, the ghost of Gaza will be able to haunt Israel? You know, it will be very difficult, even just maneuvering around the world, to outlive what's been done in Gaza. You know, it would be difficult to operate.
Well, we actually don't understand what the depth of their political and social ostracization will be. Because this is the first time in history it's been live streamed. And that's never going away. It's inescapable. There's no like, we're going to rewrite history books. No, the internet's forever. Circling back to, you know, some of the pros and cons of the internet. That's one of them.
And in a crazy way, all of us. And this is really just an amazing change in where the power of the sort of mainstream media. Now we've been part of the documentation. And that all together, taken all together, will contribute to a wider understanding of what has happened.
And can you imagine, like, however this ends, whenever this ends, like the post-mortem on what happened in Gaza is going to be...
Could be even worse than it is now, because more information is going to be available as well.
I mean, imagine when UN observers go in and start getting compiling testimony, and like, we've only seen like the tip of the iceberg of what's actually happening.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Greg. Very, very enlightening podcast with you.
Thanks so much for having me. It was great.
Thank you for joining us on the Watchdog this week. Please do support us in any way that you can. Peace and love.